ABC General Hospital spoilers reveal that the city of Port Charles seemed to hold its breath under a gray, unmoving sky, as if even time itself understood that something irreversible was about to unfold. The funeral of Marco was not merely a farewell, it was a fracture point, a moment where grief, truth, and long-buried tensions converged with devastating force. What should have been a solemn gathering quickly transformed into a charged battlefield of emotions, where every face in the crowd carried not only sorrow but suspicion, anger, and unresolved guilt. In a place like General Hospital, death was never just an ending. It was always the beginning of something far more dangerous. Marco's absence weighed heavily, not just because of who he had been, but because of what his death represented. For those who loved him, it was a wound that refused to close. For others, it was a reminder that the fragile balance of power in Port Charles had been violently disrupted. The quiet murmurs among mourners carried an undercurrent of unease, as if everyone sensed that the truth surrounding Marco's death had not yet been fully revealed. And perhaps more terrifying than the grief itself was the growing realization that someone somewhere had benefited from his silence. When Blaise returned to Port Charles, her presence alone shifted the atmosphere. She did not arrive as a grieving sister alone. She came carrying questions and perhaps even answers that others had spent weeks trying to bury. There was something in her eyes, an intensity, that hinted she had not come back just to mourn. Her connection to Marco was deeply personal, but her return also introduced a new variable into an already volatile equation. The past she shared with Christina was not just emotional history, it was a fragile thread that could either stabilize the chaos or tear it apart completely. Blaise's reunion with Christina became one of the few moments in the midst of sorrow that felt grounded, almost hopeful. Their connection, complicated and unfinished, offered a brief illusion that something pure could still exist within the darkness that surrounded them. Yet even that fragile bond carried its own tension because both women understood that love in Port Charles was never untouched by consequence. Christina, already weighed down by her own internal struggles, found herself torn between the comfort Blaise represented and the dangerous truths Blaise might bring with her. Love, in this moment, was not an escape, it was a catalyst. Meanwhile, the shadow of Sonny loomed over everything. Sonny had built his life on control, on understanding the balance between power and loyalty, but Marco's death had introduced a crack in that foundation. His enemies were no longer acting from simple ambition. They were driven by something deeper, something more personal, and no one embodied that shift more dangerously than Cullum and Sidwell. Sidwell's growing hatred towards Sonny was not impulsive, it was calculated, layered, and patient. His anger had evolved into something colder, something strategic. He was no longer reacting, he was waiting, watching, and preparing. The funeral became an opportunity, a stage where emotions were raw and defenses were lowered. In that vulnerability, Sidwell saw possibility. His silence during the ceremony was more unsettling than any outburst could have been, because it suggested that whatever he was planning would not be loud or obvious, it would be precise. Cullum, on the other hand, represented a different kind of threat. Where Sidwell was controlled, Cullum was volatile, driven by a need to eliminate obstacles rather than manipulate them. The whispers about his involvement in Marco's death were no longer distant rumors. They were beginning to solidify into something tangible. Each passing moment brought the truth closer to the surface, and with it, the inevitability of confrontation. The idea that Cullum's crimes could be exposed was no longer a question of if, but when, and that certainty began to ripple through Port Charles like an approaching storm. Blaise stood at the center of that storm, whether she intended to or not. The knowledge she carried was dangerous, not only because of what it revealed about Marco's death, but because of who it implicated. Her presence forced others to confront realities they had tried to avoid. She was no longer just part of the story, she was becoming the axis around which everything began to turn. And the more she uncovered, the clearer it became that Marco's death was not an isolated tragedy, it was a trigger, a spark that had ignited a much larger conflict. Christina felt that shift more than anyone. Her connection to Blaise pulled her closer to the truth, but it also placed her directly in the path of danger. She was no stranger to chaos, but this felt different. This was not about personal mistakes or emotional fallout. This was about something systemic, something that threatened to dismantle everything she thought she understood about the people around her. Loving Blaise meant standing beside her, but it also meant accepting the consequences of whatever truths Blaise chose to reveal. As the funeral drew to a close, the illusion of closure shattered completely. There was no peace, no resolution, only a growing tension that seemed to stretch across every corner of Port Charles. The alliances that had once seemed stable began to shift, fracture, and realign in unpredictable ways. Sonny found himself forced to reconsider not only his enemies, but his allies. Trust, once a currency he could control, had become dangerously unstable. Sidwell moved quietly, but his influence began to surface in subtle, calculated ways. He did not need to act directly, he only needed to create the right conditions for others to act on his behalf. Cullum, increasingly cornered by the threat of exposure, grew more desperate, more reckless, and in that desperation he became both more dangerous and more vulnerable. Blaze, standing between grief and revelation, became the emotional and narrative center of it all. Her determination to uncover the truth about Marco was not driven by vengeance alone. It was driven by a need to restore meaning to his death. She refused to let his story end in silence, even if speaking the truth meant unraveling everything around her. Port Charles once again stood on the edge of transformation. The funeral had not ended anything. It had begun something far more explosive. Secrets were rising, alliances were shifting, and the lines between justice and revenge were becoming increasingly blurred. In a city built on hidden motives and fragile loyalties, the truth was not a resolution, it was a weapon. And as the echoes of Marco's farewell faded into the distance, one thing became painfully clear. This was no longer just a story of loss. It was a story of reckoning, where every character would be forced to confront not only what they had done, but who they had become in the process. The grief that followed Marco's funeral did not settle into quiet mourning as many had expected. Instead, it hardened into something sharper, more volatile, something that demanded action. In Port Charles, sorrow rarely stayed pure for long, and for Blaze it had already begun to transform into a need for justice that bordered dangerously close to vengeance. Her pain was not passive, it was restless, searching, unwilling to accept that Marco's life could be reduced to a closed casket and unanswered questions. And in that restless state she found an unlikely alignment with Sidwell, a man whose motives were far more complex and far less transparent, yet whose hatred burned with a similar intensity. Their convergence was not born from trust, but from necessity. Blaze needed access, influence, and a way to cut through the layers of deception that had buried the truth about Marco's death. Sidwell, on the other hand, saw in Blaze both an emotional force he could leverage and a distraction he could use to mask his own deeper agenda against Sonny. What neither of them openly admitted, but both instinctively understood, was that revenge rarely belonged to just one person. It spread, it infected, and once set in motion, it refused to be controlled. The plan that began to take shape between them was not impulsive. It was calculated, quiet, and deeply dangerous. It revolved around exposing Cullum not just as a suspect, but as the undeniable architect behind Marco's death. Yet exposing Cullum was never going to be enough. In a city like Port Charles, truth alone did not guarantee justice. Sometimes, truth only accelerated destruction. As the pressure built, Lucas and Britt found themselves drawn into the unfolding chaos in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Lucas, already fragile from loss and the emotional aftermath of everything surrounding Marco, struggled to maintain a sense of moral clarity. He believed in accountability, in the idea that even the darkest crimes should be brought into the light through proper channels. But Port Charles had a way of eroding that belief, piece by piece, until even the most principled individuals found themselves questioning what justice truly meant. Britt's involvement was far more complicated. Her past, her instincts, and her survival-driven mindset made her uniquely suited to navigate the dangerous territory Blaze and Sidwell were entering. She understood the language of risk, the unspoken rules that governed power and consequence in this city. And yet, beneath that understanding, there was something else, something more human, more vulnerable. Britt was not immune to the emotional gravity of Marco's death, nor to the ripple effect it had created. Being pulled into this situation forced her to confront not only external danger, but her own internal contradictions. Everything converged at the hospital, at the one place that was supposed to represent healing, but had instead become a silent witness to violence, secrets, and manipulation. The ICU, sterile and controlled, became the setting for one of the most explosive turning points Port Charles had seen in years. Cullum, weakened but still dangerous, lay at the center of it all. He was no longer untouchable, no longer operating from the shadows. For the first time, he was exposed, vulnerable, and surrounded by people who had every reason to want him gone. The moment did not arrive with chaos. It arrived with a quiet tension so thick it felt suffocating. Every decision leading up to it had been deliberate, every step calculated. And when it finally happened, when Cullum's end came within the walls of the ICU, it did not feel like victory. It felt like a line had been crossed, one that could never be uncrossed. Lucas stood on the edge of that moment, caught between his conscience and the reality unfolding in front of him. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, that what had just happened would not restore balance. It would not bring Marco back. It would not erase the pain. Instead, it would create new consequences, new fractures that would spread through Port Charles in ways no one could fully predict. Britt, watching the aftermath, recognized something even more unsettling. Cullum's death did not feel like an ending. It felt like a transition, as if removing him from the equation had only made space for something else to rise. And that realization became even more terrifying when whispers began to surface about the WSB. The idea that the WSB had a new leader sent a ripple of unease through those who understood what that organization represented. The WSB was not just another player in the game. It operated above it, beyond it, shaping outcomes in ways that were rarely visible until it was too late. A change in leadership meant a shift in priorities, in strategies, in the very structure of power that extended far beyond Port Charles. And if Cullum had been a piece on the board, then his removal raised an unsettling question. Who had moved him there in the first place? Blaze began to feel that shift more acutely than anyone. What started as a personal mission to honor her brother's memory was evolving into something far larger, something she had never intended to be part of. The deeper she went, the clearer it became that Marco's death was not an isolated act of violence, but part of a broader network of control and manipulation. And that realization forced her to make a choice she had been avoiding. Her life outside Port Charles still existed. Her tour, her career, the identity she had built beyond the city's constant turmoil, it all remained waiting for her. Staying meant becoming entangled in something that might never end. Leaving meant walking away from a truth she had fought so hard to uncover. Neither option offered peace. Christina felt the weight of that choice just as heavily. Blaze's presence had reignited something within her, something that felt like hope in a place where hope was often short-lived. But their connection was no longer just about them. It had become part of a larger network of relationships and consequences, particularly with Jacinda, whose involvement introduced yet another layer of complexity. Blaze's role as a bridge between Christina and Jacinda created a fragile dynamic, one that held the potential for understanding but also for conflict. And at the center of that tension stood Michael, caught in a position that demanded impossible decisions. His connection to both sides forced him into a space where neutrality was no longer an option. Every choice he made carried weight, not just for himself, but for the people he cared about. Michael's internal struggle reflected a broader truth about Port Charles. In a city defined by shifting alliances and hidden agendas, there was no such thing as standing still. Everyone was moving, choosing, reacting. And sometimes, the hardest part was not choosing between right and wrong, but between two outcomes that both felt like losses. As the dust began to settle, if it could even be called that, the aftermath of Cullum's death and the emergence of a new WSB leadership left Port Charles in a state of uneasy transition. Nothing had been resolved. If anything, the stakes had only been raised. Blaze stood at the edge of that uncertainty, knowing that whatever decision she made would define not only her future, but the trajectory of everything she had set into motion. Revenge had brought her this far, but it had also revealed something far more complicated, that justice in Port Charles was never clean, never simple, and never without consequence. And as the city continued to shift beneath the weight of its own secrets, one truth remained impossible to ignore. This was not the end of Marco's story. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous, a chain reaction that would continue to reshape Port Charles long after the echoes of revenge had faded.